Just as a bit of background in terms of where the session came from, so we see a lot of questions from our supplier members and prospective members about what Sedex can do for their business and how else we can help them meet their ESG goals. A lot of these businesses have long supply chains and admirably some fairly ambitious ESG goals. So we thought it'd be great to, in just 30 minutes, take you through some of the different features of the Sedex membership and how these can impact your business and the people in your supply chains. Today we have Kat, who's going to talk to you about exactly that, and then we will hear from Tom, currently residing in Chile, who will be talking us through the radar tool and how data can be used in your supply chains. Finally, we will have some time for questions. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kat. Over to you, Kat.
Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. I hope that you're doing well. Today, I'd like to start by discussing what do we actually mean when we say responsible sourcing. So responsible sourcing is proactively sourcing and procuring products and services both ethically and sustainably through each tier of your supply chain. Sourcing responsibly actually helps to drive competitive advantage by improving risk management and supplier relationships. This in turn drives compliance and greater profitability, which will then deliver both short and long-term value for shareholders, investors, workers, and ultimately your business as a whole. And next slide, please. So the business case for responsible sourcing begins with better business performance. According to Nielsen, 66% of consumers said that they would pay more for sustainable goods, while 45% admitted sustainability has the power to sway a product purchase. Reduced operational costs, management of risks, and increased consumer demand are just some of the ways that your business can profit. Secondly, we look at protecting and increasing your value. Alongside consumers, investors are becoming increasingly mindful of the sustainable and ethical creation of goods and services. Research by McKinsey has shown that investors will be willing to pay a 10% premium to acquire a company that has a positive record for environmental, social, and governance issues. There are also several public examples where the share price and values of companies have dropped if they're not showing that they have a positive record for ESG, sometimes by as much as 25%, according to The Guardian. And finally, protecting your brand. Exploitative business practices are recognized as huge operational and reputational risk globally. We've seen this in examples such as the Rana Plaza garment factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, which killed over 1,000 people due to a lack of fire safety standards. This also caused reputational damage for hundreds of international retailers that were sourcing there. Next slide, please. We are seeing that some of the most increasingly powerful drivers of responsible sourcing is actually legislation, with upcoming legislation such as the European Mandatory Human Rights and Environmental Act, which states that all companies with a supply chain need to be able to identify, prevent, and mitigate risk. We can also see that Germany have recently launched their own Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which actually introduces penalties for organizations that are not in line with this. Next slide, please. Here are a few examples of some of the companies we work with at Sedex. We work with businesses all the way from startups through to multinationals, and they're all spread globally as well. Next slide, please. So here at Sedex, we have a variety of different tools and services that can help you with managing your supply chain risk. You're able to map your supply chain through these tools and collect and store the data on your suppliers. By doing this, you can then assess your supply chain and identify any areas of concern or any areas where you may need to introduce better practices in order to reduce those suppliers' risks. Next slide, please. We do this through a variety of different tools, starting with the self-assessment questionnaire. So the self-assessment questionnaire looks at 4 key areas, which we call the 4 SMETA pillars, and they are labour standards, health and safety, business ethics, and environment. And this will help to get a good understanding of the policies and processes that suppliers have in place internally. We then move through to the risk assessment tool, which Tom will be going into more detail a little bit later. but this helps to identify inherent risk, and it looks at it by country and the sector and product that the supplier is producing. We then move over to SMETA audits and virtual assessments. Most people are familiar with SMETA audits, as it is globally the most used audit methodology, and it is in line with the rest of our platform, including the self-assessment questionnaire and risk assessment tool. You can now use a virtual assessment, which was launched in response to the pandemic, which actually allows you to assess those suppliers virtually if you're not able to go and do a physical on-site audit. We then move to our reporting tools, which are accessible through Sedex Analytics. This helps to give you a comprehensive view of your supply chain while simplifying it in a way that you can present internally to business, and really helps you keep a pulse check on your supply chain and any issues that need to be addressed or may be outstanding. And then finally, we have the e-learning and training platform, which provides a multitude of different training resources that you can use in terms of how to use Sedex, how to use our different tools, but also on more developmental topics as well. So things like learning more about waste management or learning more around forced labor. You can refer suppliers to these modules and then track progress through it to help drive continuous improvement.
Kat, just to interrupt you there, I mean, a lot of our audience have probably experienced the SAQ part of this, the self-assessment questionnaire. We get a lot of questions around, is it the same for all suppliers? Can you just speak to that for a moment?
Absolutely. So we have one centralized self-assessment questionnaire that's available through the platform. It consists of around 300 questions. Everyone will answer the same questions. However, it will filter out which questions the supplier is answering depending on what sector they belong to. So some suppliers, for example, a small potato picking farm, may be looking at answering around 150 questions, whereas a full manufacturing company may be close to the 300.
Okay, so you don't end up answering lots of questions that are irrelevant to your business. It is tailored based on who you are as a company.
Exactly.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Next slide, please. Perfect. So in addition to those core tools, we also now offer a variety of additional services. The first of which is data matching. So data matching is the first step where we actually will help to map out your supply chain and identify which of your suppliers are key in terms of onboarding them onto Sedex, because you need to be able to risk assess them. Once we have identified which of those suppliers are the ones that you want to be up and running on the platform as soon as possible, we can also offer a supplier engagement project. So this involves Sedex with a specialized team actually reaching out to those suppliers in their local language with terminology and communication that has been agreed upon by yourselves. And they will ask the supplier to join the platform as a B member, much like the majority of you on this call. And they will then get them to complete the self-assessment questionnaire, connect with you so that you then have a much kind of quicker onboarding process. And you'll be able to start managing that data as soon as possible. Once you have onboarded those suppliers, either by doing it manually yourselves or by opting for the supplier engagement project, the next step is then to report. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we do have Sedex Analytics, which has hundreds of different reports that you can access to actually begin managing those suppliers. But in addition to that, we also offer bespoke reporting as well. So we will actually work with you if you need reports that are not already available through Analytics, and we will help to create those so that you can then have reports against your supply chain that are looking at the metrics and KPIs that you actually need as a business. We then move to ethical trade coordinators. Ethical trade coordinators are essentially individuals that work for Sedex, but also for your organization. So they can be based within your own company, as in your own head offices, or they can be based in the Sedex head office. The majority are actually a mixture of both, but they come with all of the in-house knowledge of Sedex, how to use the platform to the best of its ability, how to make sure the processes are moving smoothly, but also they get to completely understand your organization, which will help in terms of rolling out the various different kind of management processes that you build, and as well as pulling off different reports, statistic measurements, and identifying KPIs. And then finally, we have consulting. Consulting is the newest kind of arm of the additional services that we offer. We have a consulting team that help to support members with a wide variety of different responsible sourcing challenges. The team actually help various companies on their responsible sourcing journey. And this can kind of vary quite massively. So it can be some people that are at the very beginning of their responsible sourcing journey and maybe aren't particularly kind of sure of where to move from that point or how to get started, all the way through to global multinationals that have whole teams dedicated to this, but may need more direction or more hands on deck or just more experience in-house. We're currently working with a variety of different members, including some B members, to kind of get ready for an upcoming AB membership to make sure that you have the various different policies in place, especially when considering the new kind of directives that have come from the EU and Germany as well. We're helping our members to make sure they're ready for this and they have suitable kind of measurements and risk assessment processes in place.
So Kat, just on consulting, because as it is quite a new part of our organisation, how will businesses go about, drawing down on that services? What does that look like in practice?
In terms of how would they start the process of consulting?
Yeah, so perhaps some of our members now are thinking, well, we're not sure where to start. How would they go about engaging with us to request that service?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the best way of doing so is by emailing the consulting email that we have at Sedex or New Business. We can speak to you to get an understanding of whether moving into an AB membership would be the right first step and then to take up consulting. Or, as I said, there are a lot of organizations where actually it makes more sense to have that consultation piece at the beginning before moving over to an AB membership. So if you drop either New Business or consulting at sedex.com an email and arrange a call, we can then go through, get a really good understanding of what your business currently looks like, where you're hoping to move towards if you do have certain kind of aspirations in place, or if you don't and you don't even kind of have an idea of where you need to be, we can help you with that in terms of other examples that we have in our membership base and what they're doing and how that could fit in.
Great, thank you. And just one last thing, sorry, I will let you move on eventually. In terms of ETCs, so the ethical trade coordinators, do they work within Sedex or will they work on site with our customers and members?
Both. So the majority of ethical trade coordinators that we have in place at the moment have a mixed kind of time split of being in the Sedex office maybe 1 or 2 days a week, and then the remainder of the time is agreed with the company that have hired them as an ethical trade coordinator. I would say in my experience, most companies want them to be quite present within their sites and their head office so that they kind of get a very good understanding of how their various processes work and to be part of their team. So the majority have maybe like an 80-20 split where they'll be with the company and then 20% at Sedex. But they generally will have historical experience with Sedex, so they'll understand the platform, how to use it in kind of a lot of detail as well.
Okay, great. So they can be kind of flexible around what the member needs. Brilliant, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, and just to pass over to Tom Sewell now, who will be looking at radar in more depth.
Great, thanks Kat, and thanks Will for the introduction earlier. So before I dive straight into talking about the Sedex risk assessment tool, I thought it'd be useful to start at a slightly higher level and briefly explain what we actually mean by assessing risk in the context of global supply chains. So when we talk about a risk, we're talking about the likelihood that a particular hazard will occur. Now, most businesses will be used to carrying out risk assessments to understand the risk to their business, for example, the risk of financial failure. In human rights and environmental terms, rather than looking exclusively inwards at the risk to our business, the focus is instead shifted outwards to look at what adverse impacts on people or the environment our business or its partners might cause or contribute to. And then we assess the probability that these impacts might occur. Obviously, if these risks materialize, then there is also a risk to the business, whether it be from legal penalties, reputational damage, or a lack of resilience in the supply chain. But the primary lens through which we consider the risk is to the potentially impacted groups, who are known as rights holders. So these risks are theoretical. They may potentially occur rather than a negative impact that has already occurred. The aim of risk assessment then is to identify these possible risks and then grade and prioritize them according to their importance. You can take steps then to reduce the likelihood that these hypothetical problems, particularly the most serious ones, will actually occur. And in doing so, you'll help to protect these rights holders and simultaneously avoid any negative consequences for your business.
Just Tom, just to stop you there. I mean, obviously, risk is such a broad topic, but what are the types of risks we might actually see if we're using that tool and looking at it through that lens?
Yeah, good question, Will. So the framework that Sedex uses, we refer to 4 pillars. So we have 4 pillars of labour standards, health and safety, business ethics, and the environment, which is typically what a SMETA audit would cover, with the heavier focus being on labour standards and health and safety. So within each of those categories, you've got different kind of sub areas. So we might be looking at, for example, the risk of forced labour occurring, or a pollution incident within the supply chain. So in short, we're looking at kind of violations of international labour standards or environmental regulations. But yeah, it's a good question.
Great, thanks, Tom.
If we can move on, thanks. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So what should you be doing then as part of your risk assessment? Well, in 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provided a framework for businesses to understand their responsibilities for respecting human rights, the steps of which are broadly outlined in that wheel on the left there. So those steps are referred to as human rights due diligence. And as Kat mentioned, we're increasingly seeing laws around the world that are starting to mandate that businesses carry out these activities. Now, that red segment is all about identifying and assessing your risks. And the circles you can see in the slide are the different steps within that risk assessment segment. And that's where the tool that Sedex provides, called Radar, can really help. So in Radar, you gain an understanding of country and sectoral risks. And if you've connected to your suppliers through the Sedex platform, then you can also make this risk assessment even more specific. So in doing so, your process of prioritization becomes really easy, because you can use the risk categorization that Radar provides as the foundation for what you do next, which would generally be to follow up and validate whether these risks are occurring in reality. That might be through reviewing the results of a SMETA audit of your highest risk suppliers. It could involve carrying out worker surveys, or we're also seeing an increase in companies carrying out much broader human rights impact assessments of their highest risk supply chains. So you can then make sure that any negative impacts that are found are then appropriately addressed and resolved. Next slide, please. So now I'll get more into the detail of Radar. Radar is basically divided up into 3 component parts, the first of which is called the pre-screen tool. And this part can be used at the very start of your risk assessment process, even before you've connected to any of your suppliers in the Sedex platform. Within the pre-screen tool, Radar provides what we call inherent risks, which basically means the level of risk based on the country and the industry sector of a particular supplier. It does this by taking 30 different data sets from reliable sources that are aligned with the different issue areas covered by the SMETA audit. So these will come from organizations like the ITUC, UNICEF, the ILO, the World Bank, Yale University, and many others. And we also have our own bespoke forced labour index that was developed exclusively for Radar and was recently updated just a couple of months ago. And within the tool, you can see exactly which sources contribute to each of the risk areas.
So Tom, there's a huge amount of information that you can get from this tool, but how might our members use it in practice?
Yeah, good question. So one way that you might use it is, say you've got 500 suppliers and you don't really know where to start. So you could use the pre-screen tool to identify, say, the 100 with the highest inherent risks. And rather than overwhelming yourself in your first year with all those 500 suppliers immediately, you could then ask those 100 suppliers to complete the Sedex SAQ, so that you can then understand more about their particular risk profile. Or as well, you might have a situation where you want to compare the risk profiles of 2 different countries, for example, if you're looking to expand your supply base, and you can do that within the pre-screen tool as well. So there's a couple of different use cases, but really it's the main focus is on getting you started and helping you to prioritize.
So, I mean, ultimately, you're talking about saving time and knowing where to look first.
Exactly. I think every company has finite resources and you can't do everything at once. So the typical framework that you'd use is focusing your attention on where you have the greatest risk. And you'll probably also want to factor in an element of, you know, your own proprietary information, such as the leverage you have with the supplier, the level of spend. So giving that layer first of all, and really targeting where your resources are best focused. Yeah, that's right.
Great, thanks, Tom.
If we can move to the next slide then, please. So once you've got your suppliers onto the Sedex platform, you can then move on to the second part of Radar, which is where you can segment your suppliers further according to their own risk factors. So it does this by taking certain information from a supplier's profile and self-assessment questionnaire that we know will generally increase or decrease a site's exposure to the risks within its country or sector. For example, a supplier in a labour-intensive sector that has a lot of low-skilled migrant workers recruited from particular countries through labour brokers is typically going to be more exposed to certain risks than a supplier with, say, a highly mechanised production process that recruits all of its workers directly. What the chart you can see shows you is that you can then basically segment your suppliers according to their risk, with the red shades indicating those suppliers that are both operating in high-risk countries and sectors and also have a profile that tends to lend itself to those risks. What you get at the very end is a simple risk category of high, medium, or low risk for each of your suppliers, but also the ability to see exactly how that score has been composed and whether there are specific risks to look out for. And Radar also factors in the most recent audit results of a site, so that if the prediction based on the data happens to come out as, say, low risk, but we know there were issues found in the most recent audit of that site, then that site will be boosted into a higher risk profile as well.
I mean, so Tommy, I mean, it looks like a really good infographic and quite informative, but how do you then access the actual data that sits behind it?
Yeah, another good question. So it's probably, I mean, it sounds a bit dull, but it's worth emphasizing that in each of the reports in Radar, you've got quite a nice visual looking dashboard where you can see the information in one way, but also always the ability to export this data into Excel. And so that's really helpful if you're going to look to integrate this information into like a daily, a weekly, or monthly process within a responsible sourcing program, because within a couple of clicks, you can download that information. You've got all the columns that you need, and you can just look at a whole kind of supply chain view of that data. So it's a kind of like a dull but very important point of the tool, that it has that you have that access to the data.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Tom, because actually it's all well and good having it within the system, but actually many businesses have lots of different data points that may not be. And so allowing them to do that, I can see how that would be more valuable than having it kind of behind a walled garden, so to speak. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Exactly. Great. If we could move on to the next slide then, please. So finally then, I'll talk briefly about the third part of Radar, which is where we can then help you to risk assess some of the audit data that's coming back from your supply chain. Now, we know that forced labor or modern slavery exists in many global supply chains, but it's pretty rare that within the constraints of a social audit, an auditor will be able to definitively conclude whether any of the workers on site are victims of forced labor. So what the forced labor indicator tool within Radar does is looks at a particular supplier's audit history and analyzes how many of the findings from those audits might be considered as indicators of forced labor. It does this using a forced labor indicator framework that was developed by the International Labour Organization, and Sedex has since translated into the context of social audits and assigned certain weightings according to the strength of the indicator. So you can use this tool either to review the types and the strengths of indicators being found within, say, a particular country in your supply chain, or you can see which of your suppliers may have a pattern of indicators over time. And this is rolled up into a simple score so that you can easily focus your attention, again, on those suppliers with the greatest risk, this time according to the audit data. Further check these scores alongside the score of our forced labor index to see if any of those suppliers are also located in countries with a high risk of forced labor. So from there, you could start looking into the detail of the indicators and start the process of identifying whether there's any action you could take to help reduce those risks. So say, for example, you've identified that forced labor is a risk in Malaysia. You could use this tool to quickly check that the audits of your suppliers there and whether they've identified any indicators. And if they have, you could work with your suppliers to try and understand what the root causes of those are and help correct them, which, going back to that human rights due diligence, would be that second step of taking effective action. So that really concludes my whistle-stop tour of risk assessment and radar. And I'll hand back to you, Will.
That's great, Tom, and thank you to both you, Tom, and to Kat for your presentations there. We do have a little bit more time, and as promised, we will go to some questions. Tom, apologies, I'm going to put you back on the spot because the first one I think is for you. What are the biggest challenges for businesses in using this sort of data?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think every company has challenges with data, whether it be, first of all, getting access to the data, who holds the data about your supply chain and contacts and where sites are located. Then you've got issues with quality of data, is it missing certain information that you need? But I guess in the context of the Sedex data, probably one of the key things is around managing the data between platforms. So you've got your own kind of internal supplier list, and then you've got suppliers connected to you on the Sedex platform. So making sure that you're either adding the unique Sedex reference of a particular supplier or supplier site into your own internal systems, or adding your internal reference into the Sedex database, I think is really important, because then, as we say, when you export that information from Excel and want to merge the two things together, you've got that unique identifier that can map the two things together, and that's something I think that's probably really important. But yeah, I guess the broader message with regards to data is everyone suffers, I think, from data challenges, and not to be overwhelmed by it. It doesn't stop you from getting started.
Great, thanks, Tom. Just as a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. One more, again, I think this one's probably to you, Kat. What is the first step a business or businesses should take if they are completely new to this?
It's on screen, actually. Email new business. We have a team that's dedicated that will help to kind of have a call with you and understand exactly where you're currently at, any processes that you have in place if you do have any, and just get a really in-depth understanding of how your supply chain currently works. And then once we have that information, we can then best advise you on what the next steps potentially could be. We can give you a dedicated platform demonstration as well, and actually show you the tools in action, how they work, how they could be utilized by your business, and it will all be tailored to yourself. So yeah, I would say contact new business.
Okay, right, an easy one for you then, Kat, that was. Another one here. So they've said that sometimes you might get resistance from suppliers. I guess question to either Tom or Kat, how do you get suppliers to get on board with this kind of approach?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I mean, the first thing is probably, or the main thing is probably around good communication. So first of all, explaining to suppliers what your overall sustainability strategy is and how they fit into that. But then they understand why you're going to be asking something of them, and how they fit into that broader vision. Then it's probably just about being very clear in terms of setting out your expectations. So making sure that any requirements you're going to set that might be around Sedex membership or completing SAQs are built from the outset into any contractual terms that you have. And also making sure that you've got like a supply chain policy document that's accessible to all of your suppliers, so they're really clear what's expected of them and why. And we've seen where companies don't communicate well from the start, and the result, I think, is that everything goes at a much slower pace than you would like. Is probably one of the key learnings that we see here at Sedex.
Yeah, that makes sense, Tom. And thank you. I mean, I guess communication is everything. I mean, it's the bedrock of all good business relationships. Time for one more, because I'm conscious of time. So apologies if we haven't got to your questions. Someone said here that the landscape, I think they mean responsible sourcing landscape, is constantly evolving. How do we stay on top of the latest trends or requirements? How can Sedex help with that?
So I would say one of the main kind of ways to do that is through the Sedex community. So we have a dedicated group, which is essentially a collaborative community which actually supports you. So we have kind of 4 different kind of key terminology things that we use. So we have discoverers, learners, builders, and leaders, which just refer to the fact that everyone is at a different point of their journey, which allows you to then meet like-minded individuals that are at the same kind of stage as you. We can give you best practice, we can talk through kind of legislation, so that everyone can kind of work and grow together. We'll also provide case studies as well, so we can kind of show the best practice in that area. And then additionally, you can sign up to webinars such as these or use the various different modules on the e-learning platform as well.
Great, thanks, Kat. And I know we've now run over, so look, just to say once again, thank you to both Kat and Tom. Hopefully you found this an insightful session for everyone online. Thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are. The recording will be sent out shortly, but if you'd like any more information, as Kat said, please reach out to us at new.business@sedex.com or your relationship manager, or alternative on our help desk. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.